everyone, welcome back to Crochet and Crime, where I crochet and I tell true crime stories. Today we'll be talking about Charles Manson. Charles Manson is like the biggest name in the cult scene, and his story is actually really wild. And I just wanted to tell his story and all of his adventures. So yeah. I would like to put out a quick disclaimer. This does go over some abuse, and it does get kind of gruesome. So if you are not into any of that, I suggest you click away from this video. And yeah, with that, let's get into it. Charles Manson's mother was only 15 years old when she had him, and to get money so she can raise Charles was to work as a sex worker. And his mom absolutely despised Charles. She even tried to sell him at one point. And in 1939, Charles' mother went to prison for armed robbery. And so Charles had to stay with his aunt and uncle. Charles was a very troubled child, and at one point he even tried to set his school on fire, so they had to send him to a reform school. And his mom eventually went back to prison after, getting released, and Charles had no place to go, so they sent him to an all-boys school. And after 10 months, Charles ran away and went to go find his mom, which he did, and she continued to neglect him. For years, Charles would have this pattern of being sent to school for boys, run away, commit a crime, and then get sent back to a school. And in these schools, he would be abused and sexually assaulted. When Manson turned 20, he married a 17-year-old girl named Rose. He knocked her up, and they stole a car and drove up to Los Angeles. Charles was caught and sentenced to 3 years in prison. And while in prison, Rose had the baby and ran off with another man, leaving Charles. When Charles got out of prison, he fell back into the crime scene. And he was a pimp for a while. He would steal cars and make false checks. Literally anything. Charles was caught for violating his parole and was sentenced to 10 years, but he only served 7. During this time, Charles learned to play guitar and he began his love for music. Charles fell in love with the warmth and life that prison gave him, and when he was released, he actually asked if he could stay, but they booted him anyways. And when Charles got out in 1967, there was like a plethora of hippies and stoners and people that are looking for like a spiritual guide or like some sort of like trippy business to get into. And it was completely different for Charles. And LSD was also kind of new around this time, or at least it was introduced around this time, so everyone was like tripping balls. Charles had long hair, a guitar, and he was always talking about how the system was fucked. So that was definitely his cup of tea. And he would play his music, and the people who met him said he was a very charismatic person. Charles had this huge following of people, and the way he would get the men in the group to stay is that he would sell off the women in the group for like sex and other things like that. Charles called this group his family, and so in the summer, they all drove in a big bus to Los Angeles, and that's when 2 of the girls were hitchhiking to like their spot of where they were gonna be staying, and and one of them spots a man named Dennis Wilson. Now, if you don't know who that is, I'm a bit offended, but I'll let it slide. Anyways, he was in a band called the Beach Boys. And so he picks up the ladies and takes them over to Charles and the other family members, I don't know. I'm just gonna call them the family members. And Charles actually becomes really good friends with Dennis, and the whole Manson family ends up moving in with Dennis in his home. Charles was actually very close to becoming a member of the Beach Boys until the other members told Dennis that Charles only wanted to do like drugs and party all the time. And so eventually Dennis cut ties with the family and kicked them out. And the song Bluebirds Over the Mountain was actually a song that was made by Charles that the Beach Boys recorded and didn't credit him for. There was also a producer named Terry Melcher, and Terry actually took some of Charles' songs and would record them and sell them, which pissed off Charles, rightfully so. Susan Atkins, who was in the family, actually found them a home, which was an old movie set, and the family moved in, and they did drugs, and they were just having the time of their lives. Charles then told them that he was the noble one, and he knows all, and he even went as far as telling them to forget about their pasts and their family, and he would not let them leave the house unless they had permission from him. Tex, who was a member of the family, was a drug dealer, and he met up with a man named Bernard Crow, and Tex had bought $12,000 worth of drugs, and he didn't have all the money, so he took the drugs and said he would be back to get more money, and Bernard was like, "How do I know you'll, come back?" Tex told him that he would leave his girlfriend there, and so Bernard agreed, and Tex never came back, leaving his girlfriend with a random-ass man. And so Bernard was holding this lady hostage until Tex came back. And Tex's birth name was Charles, but they called him Tex. So when Bernard called the house to get a hold of Tex, he asked for Charles, and Charles Manson answered, and Bernard asked for the money and said if he didn't get it, he would burn down the ranch that they were living in and would sexually assault all the women. Charles was like, well, shit, can't have him doing that. So he met up with Bernard, and he shoots him and takes the girlfriend and leaves. Charles didn't know that Bernard survived,